Okay, well, welcome everybody. With that, we're going to get started. And I really appreciate you taking the time to do that. We're hoping that we can start, again, building more cross-pollination and hearing, oh, that's what that county's doing. I want to jump in on that or connect with them more. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a quick overview of what we're doing today. You may remember this diagram from Anna Cash's presentation last time of the various different kinds of ways that people are housed currently in the Bay Area. Today, we're really going to zoom in on one particular piece of that, and that's subsidized housing. So this is like, how do governments participate in making sure that people can afford their rent and have a place to stay long term? And we're doing that because this is one of the housing tenure types that as government agencies, like we touch most, like a lot, right? Like we're in various different ways, our jurisdictions, whether or not it's the health department, are involved in helping with subsidized housing. And again, I said this last time, but we're going to take a really deep dive on this, and we're doing that especially because our health directors, when I did a round of calls around the region, they were like, this is something we want to make sure our staff understand. What I'm hoping that you take away today, we're going to have a pretty detailed conversation. James and Devin are like super experts on this. What I'm hoping that you take away is actually like some of the detail, but largely the high level pieces around like what are some of the considerations that developers, like nonprofit developers in particular, well, all kinds of developers who are working on affordable housing are thinking about when they're trying to build or continue to run affordable housing. In particular, so that we can, when we are engaging in conversations about like, what's the housing situation in our county, we can weigh in a helpful way. And then two, I think as public health, we often show up to the table and we're like, we want childcare and we want some green space and we want it to be extra affordable and we want, it to be extra healthy. And some of the stuff they're going to take us through is like some of the trade-offs and balances of like what affordable housers actually go through to make sure to like provide housing, and what are some of the entry points that we can weigh in, both like what are times that are helpful for our voices to be in the mix, and then also like what are some of the constraints that they're under. How do we recognize those constraints? How do we, like in time, like help actually remove some of them? But then given where they're at now, how do we help bring health to the table, but in a really practical way? Sound good? Okay. I'm gonna turn it over.
Great.
Specifically on that last slide, within subsidized, there's a lot of preservation work going on, and we're really focused on production for this conversation. The undercarriage for both is pretty similar, but just want to make that clear as you start to do the presentation.
Yeah, and one thing is I haven't actually introduced myself yet. So hi everyone, I'm James Gallen. I also work at Enterprise Community Partners. A lot of my work actually has to do with preservation. So I work with Devin, who works more on the national team. I work out of the San Francisco office. So maybe at some time in the future we can talk more about preservation, or I can join in on a conversation on that. There's been a lot of conversations around, acquiring buildings on the market and subsidizing them and keeping them permanently affordable and doing all the health and building safety upgrades that are necessary to keep them in the housing stock and keep residents safe and healthy. But that's not, as Devin was saying, what we're talking about today. So Will kind of alluded to this. We're covering a lot of material today. Some of it, we try to make it as comprehensive as possible while also trying to account for the short amount of time we have. There might still be some jargon or technical language or terms that just aren't familiar. I want to keep this conversational. If people have something that comes up that doesn't make sense, or is, again, jargon or vocabulary that isn't familiar, just raise your hand or throw something at me or Devin, and we will try to define it. And we'll have some time at the end for some questions and answers as well. So we're going to walk through quickly who's Enterprise. What does it mean when we talk about affordability? Affordability for who? The typical development timeline and what goes on through the development process. What are the operating economics? So what are the funding and financing considerations, the costs that have to be accounted for when you're bringing funding for a project? So on the operating level, sort of, day-to-day operations, and also the development pro forma basics. And if you haven't seen the term pro forma before, don't worry, we're going to come back to it. So bringing essentially what sources of funding do you need to have at the front end to make sure you're accounting for your total development costs and being able to operate the project sustainably into the future. And then finally, a little bit on some of the state and local sources of funding that folks might encounter on a more regular basis. A lot of the funding we're talking about comes from the federal level through the low-income housing tax credit, which we're going to go into some detail about. But there are also local and state sources that come into play to fill the gap, to provide additional amenities, to do, I heard a number of folks talk about energy retrofits, greening, urban greening, safety upgrades. At the end. Devin, is there anything you wanted to add here? No, I think so. So quickly, who is Enterprise? We are a national nonprofit organization. We are what's called an intermediary. So we do a number of things. We do financing, loans, and investment through the low-income housing tax credit, as well as other forms of equity, which is a term we're going to define a little bit later. We do advocacy and policy work. So as again, I work out of the local office. So I work with the City of Oakland, I work with San Francisco, I work with regional governments to help develop housing programs and inform policy as it's created. And then we do a variety of technical assistance. So consulting on how to use different funding sources, trainings such as this, a variety of ways that we play as this convener in between role to try to bring together a diverse group of stakeholders and get everyone on the same page to advance this mission of creating opportunity for low and moderate income households through diverse, thriving communities. There's a question. Yes.
The last bullet about creating 340,000 affordable homes over how much time?
So I think this number
since 1982.
Since I believe that's like, and that's probably not up to date. Honestly, this is an old number, so maybe it's a little more than that now. But yeah, and that's primarily through directing investment into the low-income housing tax credit, but also through a number of other ways. So you talked about this a little bit at the in the last session, it sounds like, but I just wanted to reiterate, who is eligible for affordable housing. Typically, we're talking about families that are at the 80% of area median income or below, and these are the numbers that HUD provides through their calculations for four-person households in 2018. So as you can see, in Alameda and Contra Costa, that's around $89,000. For San Francisco, it's a little closer to $95,000 for the low income. But of course, when you get down to folks that are lower on the income spectrum, 35,000-ish, and even below, the rents that these folks can afford, which I believe was defined last time, but again, 30% of income, these are extremely low rents. These are not rents that you're likely to find on the market, especially when you're talking about 2, 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom units to house families. So that is where these variety of subsidy sources come into play to make these projects work. So what does it take to build affordable housing? These are sort of the 4 high-level components. Obviously, you need land, you need a site, you need funding from a variety of sources, which we're going to talk about later. You need policies that create incentives to create affordable housing, that might streamline development for affordable housing, that provide additional sort of local sources for affordable housing, and then, of course, capacity. So there's a large team that goes into the development process, creating affordable housing, including community input, specialists such as you. And finally, you need political will, right? So building any sort of housing in the Bay Area is challenging. There's a lot of local opposition. There's a lot of administration or bureaucracy that goes into it, decision-making at various levels. But affordable housing is especially challenging, as we all know, just given the stigma around it, the opposition that it tends to face at the local level. So there really is this need for marshaling as much political will to advance these projects, and that happens in a variety of ways. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Devin to talk about the stages of development and what that sort of looks like to bring a project from idea to completion.
So let's see here. We're sort of just kind of framing out the way that a developer is sort of walking through the different stages of a project. But at the outset, we're talking about a 5 to 7 year timeline. Just to think about that, and about half of that is raising the money and coupling that together. There's a lot of holding costs, so folks get kind of impatient, and it's kind of self-inflicted, right? This is the way we structure our community development finance system, where developers cobbling together dollars is driving about half of that extended timeline. So we've got to go through that, but just keep that sort of overall chronology in your mind. So when we start to think about developing a project, you really have to start with this concept of what makes a project work. So there's this idea of these building blocks, but for any deal to go, you need this piece around desirability, which is sort of what are folks going to fund, where is the political will, what is the community, what do the grass tops folks think the community needs, or the grassroots folks think the community needs. So is it the right project for the place that you're working? There's the financial feasibility. So just in broad strokes, is this thing going to work? Does it need an ocean of grant money, or can you use some debt to make it work? Generally, do the numbers sort of work? And then there's the viability piece, which is often overlooked, which includes not just sort of, is it legal? Do you have the zoning, which we'll talk about in a little bit? But is there someone who wants to do this project? Is there a developer who is wanting to do that type of housing in that location? So it's not just necessarily, is there the technical capacity, but is there the will? And that's organizational as much as it's political. So these slides, full disclosure, were pulled from another project that I work on called the Strong, Prosperous, and Sustainable Communities Challenge. And so you'll see on here this bit about centering racial equity in each step of the process. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in that here, but because it's so much of the work that I'm doing in other projects, I couldn't bring myself to pull it off the slide. So it's there. If you have a really burning question about it, we can talk about it, but I will probably be glossing over that as we go along.
And Devin, I would just say, like, that's also a central focus of many of our health departments and also our care teams. And so I do think that there's places that we all care deeply about that. So if you want to kind of highlight it here also, appropriate place.
We've got the charge to go deep in the weeds, keep it simple, and do it in an hour.
right. With the balancing act.
Okay, so the first stage is really kind of understanding how it's all going to end, and we'll talk through sort of what that means. But when the idea comes up, when there's a site that comes on the market, when in the third glass of wine, you start getting this idea going. The first thing that any developers need to do, or organization that's looking for a developer to partner with, is really understand where they want to end in all of this. Because making it up as you go along is how projects get hung up. And so, some of that is what's the operating mission, what is sort of the service mission of that project, what happens with the site of the project, not just when it opens, but at year 10 when maybe an investor exit, year 20, year 30. So what happens with that over a much more extended period of time? What are the most important and least important aspects of the project? Where can you give? Are the rents the most important? Are the services more important? Can you accept a mixed income project? Because there's going to be some give and take along the way, and you have to start sort of understanding that. And I'm saying this sort of is also from the developer's point of view, right? So we'll just try to build some empathy there. And then what role do you want to play? So this is sort of assuming the developer's perspective, but there are many other folks that help move a project along, both in terms of getting the deal done, in terms of long-term operation. And that early stage is really just about spending the time to think it through. That there's not a lot of resource involved. I'll sort of toggle back and forth between the text slides and this kind of flow chart, which is mostly in here, and I'm standing in front of a lot of it actually. So this is mostly in here as kind of a leave behind, moving furniture, say adaptive. So we'll sort of toggle back and forth here. Again, this is something that the folks can kind of spend some time with when the materials go out. But generally, this is the part where it's simple. What do you want to do? What do you want for your organization? What role do you want to play? A big part of that early assessment is the zoning and the entitlement feasibility. And so often these conversations start with a site. There's a piece of dirt that someone's excited about, and you want to do something on that. And early on, you understand what you can legally do based on the current zoning. This is also really important because often there are plan amendments or zoning changes to facilitate a project or a certain type of project in a community, and the timing of that becomes really important, particularly if it's going to significantly increase the value of the site. And you don't own it yet.
Can I jump in for a quick
Yeah.
second? Can anyone say just like what zoning is?
Zoning.
Yeah. Oh, look at you reading the slide. Yeah, exactly. And it's done often by, like, this is a zoning map, for instance, in Solano County. And you can see like there's different kinds of designations about what you can build in certain places. I know this is old hat for some of you, but I think for some of you it may be new. And I did want to also just plug, some of this comes from this Lots and Lots, which is an online game that like teaches actually like how you do zoning. And I would really encourage you, for those of you who are newer to this, just to like play it once and see what it's like. That's all. Thanks, Devin.
The pieces in there are sort of what the eligible uses are, which can get tricky with some of the service housing, but also the development standards. So how high can you go? What are the setbacks? All those sorts of things. Like what is the physical volume you can put there, which tends to matter as soon as you start designing. So some of this refinement is really about taking that cocktail napkin and really starting to do some desktop research. What do you think different things are going to cost? Start to talk to contractors, start to get a sense of the market. A lot of this stuff is really desktop work and doesn't involve a lot more cost. But it also, if you're thinking about that racial equity component, is like what is the history of that neighborhood, and when you start to think about what you're bringing, what is that trigger, and what conversations are you starting when you come into a place? But really, you're starting to build out sort of that they call a back of envelope pro forma, right? Just generally, what is your wild guess about how it's all going to cost, and how good or bad does it look? So you have some sense of how things shape up early on. And that involves what do you think the site's going to cost? How much of a building you think you're going to build? So your best guess about what the cost per square foot is. And that's when this thing starts to really open up. Yeah.
We agreed I'd throw a ping pong ball at you
Yeah.
every time you use jargon. Can you say what a pro forma is?
Pro forma. So the pro forma, in the simplest term, is a spreadsheet that captures two things: what the operating budget of the building is over time, so typically over a 5 to 10 year window, depending on how long you're going to hold that, and then what the development or acquisition budget is. So what's it going to cost to get that building built or buy the building in day one? So those two things together, and they're linked in ways that we'll explore. That was when you prepped me for it. I knew that ping pong ball was coming. So this is, once you start to unpack that concept, get off the cocktail napkin, it starts to really open up. You're thinking about, marketing, leasing, sort of tenant needs. You're thinking about architectural design. You're thinking about how you can put the money together, and you have to sort of start thinking about all that as soon as you're thinking about a project. From there, you'll go a little deeper and actually start to spend some money. So the zoning, you can take a quick look, but once you start to go deeper, you want somebody on the team that's really versed in that and can find out where the red flags are. You're starting to develop cost estimates, and maybe that's paying a professional to really dig into the basics of the building. Starting to do some design development. And it's also when you start to think about partnership needs. So often groups will conceive of a project that they can't pull off on their own, right? If you're needing new markets tax credits, so it's an obscure funding source. If you're doing really complex land assembly, if you're going to need to hold something for 10 years and you don't have the balance sheet for it, there are important roles for partners that you want to explore as soon as you're starting to get real about a project.
There was some jargon thrown in there. Just want to make sure. Balance sheet might be a good one.
So, do you have the money to pull it off, right? So if you're a two-person organization, you're envisioning a $50 million project, you might need a partner that can bring not necessarily the technical capacity to do the project, because you might have that, but you need someone who can backstop it financially. Racking them up here. And so as you go through that feasibility analysis, you really want to get to sort of a basic proposal. So what is this thing going to look like? How do you pull all that together? How do you go from a back of envelope, very, very simple pro forma to something that's somewhat well researched? You can talk someone through, explain to them what you're trying to do, how you think it's going to work. It's going to continue to move. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you need to be able to walk someone through it so you can start to build some support for the project. these are just kind of tracked through, and I will mostly skip over them. The one thing here is that we'll talk about acquisition, but at some point you want to get site control, because as you start to build a buzz for a project, as you start to get serious about it, as word gets out that you're interested, if you don't own the site or have some sort of a contractual tie to that site at a certain price, expect the price to go up. And we've seen it in all sorts of communities, both really, really strong markets and those that are still maturing, that as soon as the seller gets a sense that you want something, expect to pay more for it. So getting that site control or some sort of a contract to buy it becomes really important once you start to build those coalitions.
And something I just want to add there, and this is very much the case for preservation, is, we're going to go into this a little bit more, but to assemble the financing to do an affordable housing deal, it takes a lot more time, as Devin mentioned, it's a lot more complex. But when the site is still out there in the world for other folks to bid on, that includes market rate developers, that includes speculative investors that might not have to go through that, jump through all the same hoops so you get control of that site. They might have cash on hand. That's another sort of consideration. Very much the case with buying occupied buildings, right? As soon as the seller knows that there's interest in it, they have an incentive to try to get as much out of it as possible, including having people bid against one another. So there's this whole negotiation and toggling between what is a public process and what needs to be sort of done behind closed doors to a certain degree between the buyer and the seller in order to sort of toe that line and that balancing act to make it feasible.
And I'll just say sort of a word of caution of thinking about the different types of relationships and touch points to housing here. Often what we've seen is that part of the way folks look at getting site control is to explain to the seller how important the building is to them, or have their partners explain how important it is to address the livability condition. But it's important to recognize that all you're saying is that building is really important to me. I will pay for it. And so there's often a real disconnect between the motivations of folks, and even if it's couched in a very strong mission way, we often see groups give over a lot of leverage by explaining how important that particular site is or that particular building is, because then folks know they have something. How's everybody doing? Good, bad, too fast, too slow? Good. So once you're starting to get the pro forma pretty well put together, you've got a pretty decent sense of how things are going to shape up, you've had some professional input on it, you really have to get to this deal-making stage, which is you have to go out and identify the different sources of financing, which we'll get into more detail later on, and figure out how to start to pull all those together. And often that costs a lot of money because you're spending a lot of staff time in doing that. And you also have to really develop the design. Often folks want to know what your finishes are going to be, what's the floor plan going to look like. Putting together the partnerships, understanding, well, who's going to do the leasing and marketing on this thing, and what service package going to look like. And, so there's a lot that goes into developing that, and that's when the real money starts to flow. And it's one of the hardest parts of the project, particularly if you're not talking about a really well-resourced development, because you're out of the stage where a small $25,000 grant can really move the project along, but you're not far enough along where you can get a loan because you don't have any funding to keep. So this is a really difficult place for projects, and one that it's honestly kind of a leverage point, right? Folks need to move those projects ahead. They need partners. They need support to help flesh that out. And when those projects are important to other folks besides the developer, and there's an ability to bring some other resources in to move things along, develop designs, et cetera, that can help projects move forward. In the deal making is also, when some of those CBA conversations start to come up, the contractor, community benefit agreement conversations, or who's the contractor, what's the local hire expectation going to be, who's financially benefiting from this thing being built and operated, what's the job base going to look like, where are you finding your service coordinators, all those sorts of things that really need to be cooked up front, because you have to manage the expectations not just of the developer, but of their investors, of the lenders, of everybody involved, because they need to know that up front, and particularly if that control is going to be given over to the community, they need to be okay with that. Yeah.
Out of the stuff that you posted, when it can start going to the public?
Actually, just gonna get to that.
Okay.
Got a special slide just for that. So I mentioned site control in there. Then there's this acquisition stage, and generally, when you buy a site, then you own the site. So you have holding costs. You often have to start to take on debt and holding costs. You own a property. You have to put construction fencing up. You have to mow it, maintain it, whatever that looks like, given its context. You have property taxes, and you're probably buying it with debt. So you have to start making loan payments on a vacant site. So there's no money coming in and money's going out. So it's a tough part of the project, and that's one of those. If that's going to be a multi-year process to put your financing together or get your permits and approvals, that's when you may need partners for smaller organizations to move those projects ahead. Generally, you want to get site control as early as possible and do the acquisition as late as possible. And the stronger the market is, the closer those are going to need to be. So what do you have to close in like 36 hours on a site? So the acquisition isn't really a clear stage. It really depends on who the seller is, what's going on with the site, but also really depends on sort of this entitlement process. So all the public approvals that you need to be able to start construction. If you need to change zoning, if you need major land use amendments, are you going to talk about CEQA? Oh, you cut that.
You can mention it.
If there's anything complicated that's going to slow your project down, you're going to have to start that much earlier, right? And which means you have to buy a site earlier, which means you have to hold it cost.
So when projects say they're in the entitlement phase,
Yes.
is that acquisition already took place?
Typically, it has.
Typically, okay.
Yeah. In some cases, you
that's
can.
when the permits are kicked off. Like, what is, when is the entitlement process triggered?
So it sort of depends. So for some sites where if you already have the zoning for what you want to do,
Yeah.
you don't have any real significant utility extensions or anything unusual that you need to get other public approvals on, and it's really just a building permit, and you can do what you want to do by right. You don't have city councilors, et cetera. That can be really quick. That can be 3 to 6 months. You can buy the site pretty late, get your building permit, and go. Sometimes it might be 5 years. And so you really have to kind of work that timeline based on the particular situation that you're in, both with the site and with what you want to do. And so typically you're doing the entitlement phase and the deal making phase as best you can, right? That's kind of this juggling act where you're trying to figure out how to move the project as fast as possible as you're doing all the things you need to do.
So the entitlement process could take years, and this is what within some of your committees, like 3, and there's an entitlement stage, and they don't move from that.
Right, absolutely.
Question, is it common for nonprofit developers to buy property and then go for a zoning change?
It can be, particularly because sometimes if the zoning change comes ahead of the acquisition, the price goes up. Right? So if you rezone a property from being able to put 20 units on it to being able to put 200 units on it, the seller is going to say, well, that property is worth a lot more. I want you to pay me more money for it.
But the risk is higher because you may get denied.
Correct. Absolutely.
But people will still do that.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and in the market context, you're capturing all that upside, right? And that's why folks are interested in taking that risk because the return is high. But particularly in strong markets, some nonprofits have to take that risk because there's no way they can afford a fully attended site.
Yeah. And I think this is also where it might be useful to point out the significance of public land, to tie it into some other work that BARHII is doing, the enterprise has been engaged in. A lot of this stuff, like sort of the competition for sites in this acquisition phase, paying market rates for that site can be taken care of to a certain degree if you have public land that can be used to build affordable housing, especially in a very strong market where there's so much competition over the scarce sites that do exist, that public land becomes even more a resource because it's under public control.
And if you don't mind, if I can jump in for just a quick second. So this diagram on the screen comes from the Los Angeles Planning Department. And the page that has it actually has like a step-by-step of entitlement processes. I think it's really helpful. And I just want to point out 2 things. Like in this, they start at project 1, or like point 1, which is like, we have a project, and then it goes to like building and planning. And then it can go one of two ways. One is like, if it matches all the zoning, then it can go straight to permitting and go. And as Devin mentioned, like holding costs, like the longer you have something, the more risk you have and the more money that you're paying. So developers really like to be able to just like do the thing immediately. So some of the strategies in this region to try to make housing cheaper to build are about, can we make more projects that go like that? So like I know Sonoma, for instance, following the fires, you guys are trying to figure out more and more, how do we make projects that do that, right? And there's complexities there because in some cases, from an equity standpoint, we want to be like, oh no, we got to weigh in and make sure it's actually going to benefit our community. So it's like a back and forth about, do we try to make it cheaper, and how do we do that in a way by making it easier to get entitled, and how are we building equity into those considerations? If you can't do that, then there's often like a much longer process where you actually have to like go through some hearings, so like design review boards or planning commissions, and this is where especially some of our sister agencies are going to spend a lot of time back and forth with developers about like, maybe you could include this, or like, you know, when you actually need when a developer needs a zoning change, that's a point in which both community members and public agencies can actually weigh in to try to make sure a project actually meets the zoning, and or like meets community needs.
I mean, I suppose you kind of measure how many projects do you see. I mean, that most of us are going to the right, like, right, even for affordable housing projects.
I think that
The bulk of them.
this is relatively common. I don't
It's
know
not more
if
common
locally.
here.
Also, I don't know if it was last year or the year before that, Bill SB 35 passed, and that streamlined this process for a lot of affordable development. So increasingly, affordable developments are able to do what they call going through the ministerial process as opposed to this.
But are you seeing that in practice?
Yeah, I can't say off the back of my
Or do you,
top of my head.
because we are not,
Yeah.
even with SB 35, we
Yeah.
still see a lot of this, and that's where we need to figure out the strategy.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway.
And there are certain approval points that come into play when you bring public money in as well, so that could be part of it.
I was just going to say that this longer process hits private development much harder than it does affordable to a certain extent, because you have this financing that you're trying to put together that's probably going to take you a year or two anyway. So some of this is not as big of an issue. If it gets to 5 years or 6 years, then it's a much bigger impact. The other thing, going back to public land for a second, is often you'll see, not often, but best practice, you'll see public agencies give the site control here and allow and create a development agreement that allows the developer that they've selected to go through all these approvals for that site and then acquire it here when they're ready to close. So they don't have all those holding costs. They don't have to take out a loan. They take over. They get, you know, often property tax deferral if it's a public owner, all those things. So to the extent that there are sites that are likely going to have to do this anyway, there's an ability of the public owner to make that.
But even for the private development that we are seeing, I mean, most of our communities, the bulk of affordable housing comes from inclusionary housing, right?
Mm-hmm.
From private developers.
Yep.
So we are not doing a benefit, even if we extend the timeline of private developers who are going to be.
Oh, absolutely.
So, but we will be all better off.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on the phone?
Mm-hmm.
In the last slide, so the part of the diagram that shows the people sitting in the seat making a decision together. So that's right before the project is denied or approved. So is that to say, and we've all seen many times where the community doesn't want affordable housing there and it gets denied. Is there anything governing that piece so that it doesn't just become, you know, exclusionary neighborhood, you know, NIMBYism basically, that rules, over, you know, that like decides, or if could everything get through that point? Is there a piece that rules the community engagement piece, or that governs the community engagement piece so that it's fair?
Specific to affordable housing finance?
Yeah, I thought this whole diagram was about whether it got entitlement or not.
Yeah, so I think that there are a lot of strategies to shape the role of community voice and power building in creating political will to approve affordable housing, or in some cases to deny projects that don't include affordable housing. I don't know how you want to spend on this, Will.
I mean, I would just say quickly, Solange, that in California, there are some tools, so like the Permit Streamlining Act and like other things like that have tried to impose some kind of limits on how much time or how many hearings a city has to deny a permit or move it, or stop it from moving forward. But in most cases, like in most exclusionary jurisdictions, or in most jurisdictions that like kind of don't want housing, they've been very effective in those hearings actually just saying, no, we're not going to give you the zoning change. Sorry, project dies.
And to a certain degree, that depends on who gets on the planning commission. That's another way for people to engage and really try to shape not just the particular project, but just generally the posture that a city takes towards development, is getting community folks, people with public health backgrounds, people with service experience, people that work in impacted communities onto planning commissions. That's like a very powerful way to do that. But it's obviously a lot of politics around that, and oftentimes they're appointed by the mayor or some other process.
And the only other thing I'd add here is that the other project that I mentioned, Spark, is really looking at trying to take this, all the people of many colors in a room process, and move it back here, so that what you have is not trying to build political will for a project that's already been cooked by anybody, be it nonprofit, for-profit, whomever, but that you're feeding the pipeline full of projects that are coming out of community and community organizations, community benefit organizations, in a way that you're building the political will for the approvals, but you're also coming from the starting place. That's sort of the desirability piece of projects that are going to get a fair amount of support. That doesn't mean you're not going to run into the opposition, and you're going to have to sort of do the power mapping to get around in some cases. But you're also building in a constituency for a project early on. Yeah. Big messy diagram. The takeaway here, if you spend some time with it, is really that once you get to the advanced deal making, the developer role becomes less visionary and more sort of shuttle diplomacy, peacemaker, trying to sort of go between and figure out how to make all the pieces work, be they financial, design, construction. And so all of a sudden, it's really just about kind of figuring out how to get the gears to fit. Which is to say that the opportunity to impact the project was back here. Because once it's already becoming visible, once it's in that political process, once they've come in for financing, once they've spent 250 grand putting the thing together, they've already figured out kind of how to make that fit. And to wedge another gear in there or another bell or whistle becomes really difficult without kind of going back to the drawing board in some cases. So I'll sort of cruise through the rest of this. Once you sort of have the deal put together, you have the financing, you're entitled, you really get to pre-development and closing. The big piece here is that this is when the documents are negotiated. So things that you want to see at the back end of a project or during the operations of a project are decided before the construction starts. In the construction, project operations, and then I guess the last thing I'll touch on is then there's that back end, right? They call it a cycle for a reason, that at some point the loan term is up, the investor hits the 10 or 15-year exit that they want to get out, and somehow you have to figure out how to rework that project, and it kind of starts the cycle all over again. So, questions? Cool.
We want to just walk through this piece really fast.
Yeah,
I'll take it up after.
The ink is almost dry on the game plan here. So. Oh yeah.
This and how it transitions to that.
Mm-hmm. So as we just described, you're going through the planning, you're building the building, you're operating it. There's different pieces of debt and financing that you take on along the way. I mentioned here that one of the toughest pieces is it's finding that money to get the project ready to be able to go in for application. So before you can get any sort of pre-development financing, you have to have at least some of your funding secured. And that's typically the public money or the low-income housing tax credits, but otherwise you can't really get funded. So that's what makes it so difficult. Once you get some of that funding in place, then you can get this bridge financing that'll pay for your plans. You can put together the construction financing to build a building, and then you'll have a third phase that takes out the construction loan. The issue though is you have to do it all in reverse. So at the beginning I said you have to start with where you want to end. When you put together the pro forma, you have the operating budget of the project, so you'll show what it's going to look like over 10 years. And then from there, you'll work backwards into, okay, now how do you build it based on what it's going to do once it's up running. And once you know all that, then you can start to think about an acquisition loan or a pre-development loan to put the permits package together. But that's kind of the flow of putting the together. Yeah.
Thanks, Devin. So I'm going to take over for a bit and just talk a little bit about that last piece. So starting in reverse with operating the building, right? So we talked a quick definition of pro forma. There are two distinctions here. There's the operating pro forma, which is sort of, as the name suggests, how the budget works over time, just operating the building, and then there's the development pro forma. So just in the most basic definition, when you're looking at the operating pro forma, you're looking at what rents you're bringing in, subtracting out the operating expenses, and the result of that is the net operating income, NOI. So that's a term you're going to hear a lot in real estate development. And that NOI, net operating income, that is going to determine how much debt you can bring into a project. Just like, you know, when you go to buy a home, your income is going to determine to a large degree how much of a mortgage you can take on. And I'll dive deeper into what those different pieces are. So this is sort of like a standard setup. And just diving in really fast into those operating expenses, there's a number of things to consider here. There's the salary and administrative costs. So who's staffing the project, who's going to be working on the project management, if there's security needs on the project, ongoing repairs and maintenance. So you have to have a reserve for that. That's going to be part of your operating expenses. So when there's sort of the ongoing maintenance that needs to be done, fixing windows and doors and leaky faucets, but then these big capital improvements that arise from time to time. So that's going to be part of your budget. There's property taxes, and you know, if you're an affordable housing developer, there are a variety of tax abatements, basically exemptions you can get to lower that operating cost, which are critical. But there are certain things that you could have to pay taxes on. There are other, you know, business taxes, et cetera. Utilities, there's a lot of considerations to go into that. That's where you're going to be thinking about energy retrofits, ways to bring down those utility costs as well as improve the environmental or you know, lower your environmental impact in operating the building. And then finally, services. So obviously, this is a key to a lot of folks in the room, especially when you're doing a project that is housing people with certain special needs, formerly homeless folks, people with disabilities, veterans, et cetera, bringing in supportive services, case management, things like that. Paying for those services comes out of your sort of operating expenses, and that, again, comes out of your income here. So just walking through a conventional residential project, you have your rents, you have the operating expenses all discussed earlier, and then the debt payments, which we're going to get into a little bit more. But just like you pay for a mortgage in monthly installments, you have debt payments that you have to make on your project. And that, when you subtract that out, what results is the cash flow. When you have affordability restrictions, as you'd expect, the rents are going to be a lot lower. We saw at the very beginning of this what the affordable rents look like compared to what you'd expect to see on the market. Depending on the income level of the folks that you're providing housing for, depending on the sources of funding that are being brought into the project, that's going to impact the rents that can be charged. And of course, that's going to lower your income. So that is going to decrease the amount of debt that you can bring in, the size of the loan you can take on for a project, because you have to pay that loan off with these rents. And it might also increase the operating expenses as you bring more services into the project, if you add community space. You know, affordable housing developers are doing more than just housing, right? They're trying to provide for a range of community needs on site and in place. So that's of course going to lower the cash flow, and the cash flow is the money that ultimately goes to investors and other folks in the project after your debt and your operating expenses are paid for. There's a question?
So in these types of housing, do you calculate in and assume subsidized housing as part of your income with Section 8 or funding from other programs? Can you include that as part of your rent, even though that's not what the tenant is paying, or can you only include the tenant paying?
Yes, there's some complications in how it comes into the project budget, but absolutely. So there are operating subsidies, which you now see over here. So this is a project that, let's say, this is an extremely low-income development, so people making 30% of the area median income or below. Some folks that might not be able to pay anything for rent or just sort of a nominal rent. So your rents are actually going to be less than the operating expenses themselves, right? The cost of operating the building, let alone any debt. So in this case, you can't really get a conventional mortgage because you don't have enough rent to support debt. And that's where operating subsidy is going to come into play.
One other thing on that, that's what makes project-based Section 8 so important.
Right.
So if you have if most of the housing authority vouchers go to individuals and those are floating, you can't really capture that in a project budget because you don't know how many folks are going to be there, how long they're going to stay, et cetera. When you project-base those vouchers, you can assume those as revenue because you have a contract with the housing authority and you can use that to leverage debt.
So tell me a little bit more about that. So you will assign so many units reserved for Section 8 and you will make that agreement with the housing authority?
Yeah, so typically it starts with the housing authority making that available, and they'll say, we'll assign you, say, 20 vouchers.
Units.
And we'll do that on a 5-year contract or a 10-year contract. And so you can assume the full market rent that HUD will pay, which is often well above what your caps would be for other affordable housing sources. And folks can still pay, you can still service extremely low income folks. But that only
that money goes to the development, the affordable housing development, building the Section 8.
Section 8.
Yeah. Section 8.
Project-based Section 8 or vouchers the same way that the individual pays 30% of their income to the project or the landlord, the owner, whomever, and HUD writes a check for the rest, the difference between what they can afford to pay at 30% of their income and market rate for that project. So you get kind of 2 checks coming.
And with project-based Section 8, because it's sort of a contract that guarantees more or less a revenue stream, you can then use that to get a loan at the front end, which I'll explain maybe a little bit more. There's a lot of content to get through, not a lot of time.
In your previous slide, when you have the cash flow in an affordable housing project, so that cash flow, where in an affordable, if they have any cash flow in the affordable housing project, who does that go to? Is it investors? Where does that? Who captures that?
Or the project sponsor. So if it's a low-income housing tax credit deal, it's actually not typically going to go to the investor, right? Because the investor doesn't want to get, the investor's primary benefit is tax credits.
Yes,
so you don't want to get more income to be taxed later.
Who captures that?
So it depends on a tax credit project. This will, you engineer it so that this goes to the sponsor developer, right? The nonprofit organization. There are other.
Will be the profit making of the affordable housing developers? Is that how would you? I'm trying to see, like, because in the affordable housing, like, how do you reinvest that money? Like how? Because I receive so much subsidy. That is like.
How do you capture it back? So the problem is that often, we'll get to the issue here, but the subsidy is going to cover the gap to build the building. So even though there's a lot of money in, there's not that much money out, which is why you don't see the private market making that investment. So this will often go to the sponsor. The other thing you need to think about is that this is also kind of the project cushion, right? Because you're going to make some estimates along the way about the operating expenses, and if you're wrong, this is the only cushion you have left. And so typically, when you go to get a loan, they'll max you out at about maybe 80% of your NOI and say you need to have some cushion in there. The other thing, though, is in this market in particular, you're starting to see things like the Kaiser equity funds that are really looking to say, how can we do that? How can we look at a little sliver of cash flow and accept a really small return as an investor, but have it feel a little bit more like a conventional equity investment? And so some of that is that little trickle of cash flow that they hope is, you know, more than a trickle. And some of it is looking at what happens at the back end of the project and seeing, can we keep it affordable and get some of our money back 10 years on?
And then, you know, if there is any cash flow that goes to the developer, that might be the cash on hand, not only to deal with unforeseen maintenance or capital investment needs, but also if there's a requirement for a project for the developer to put their own money into it. For example, with that Kaiser fund, there is what's called the sponsor equity requirements, so they actually have to take money out of their own pocket to invest in that project. That's where that's going to drop.
The reason as to why I asked is because in the Bay Area, there's so many of the big affordable housing developers who became more like CEOs and like, you know, we have $1 million, you know, salaries that the people are questioning the public, you know, support for projects. And then it's like, okay, the mid-band housing, I mean, we all value that. And yet, with people that don't understand, it's like it's the NIMBYs community, then they complain, they say, look at them, they're like, you know, driving their Tesla, right? Stuff like that. So it's interesting to see, you know, the profit-making piece of it.
I was just gonna go there, sorry, because I was gonna say that California is sort of the envy of the nation because of the strength of the affordable housing developers that you have here. There are folks that can hold a site for 10 years and get it entitled. There are so many places where there's nobody in the nonprofit sector that can do anything like that. You know, they have the balance sheets to be able to do different partnerships or public-private partnerships or do joint venture projects with the private sector that a lot of folks just don't have. And some of it comes from the fact that they've accumulated some financial strength and a strong portfolio over time. So it's a tough one.
So I want to suggest that we kind of go through this set of slides and then kind of
we can do some. And I also wanted to point out that the primary way that nonprofit developers or LIHTC developers are getting paid through this is not necessarily through the cash flow, but through what's called the developer fee. And that is a sort of a fixed percent typically that's factored into the budget. That's going to be like a percent of the development costs. So less this and more just sort of like baking it in on the front end as a cost of doing the project. Because with the expectation that there isn't going to be much cash flow in the way that a market rate developer will be able to generate money. So now we're going to transition over to the development pro forma, right? So we talked about the operating budget a bit. This is the component where you're looking at all the different sources that are brought in to pay for all these uses that go into the development of the project. And this is sort of a breakout of what those common costs are. The land, soft costs, which, you know, the environmental review you have to do, you have to pay for that. You know, lawyers and other specialists that have fees, that's all coming out of your soft costs. There's the actual construction of the project, so materials and labor. The financing costs, so you're paying debt service, you're paying origination fees for the loans that you're taking out, and then the actual costs that come with leasing the building, getting folks into the building when it's not occupied, especially the vacancy loss, as that's called. In the early phase. So how does all this get paid? Through a combination of hard debt, soft debt, and gap funding. What's hard debt? We're going to talk about that on the next slide, actually. So I'll hold that ping pong. And then equity, as we were just discussing. So I don't expect you to read this whole slide. It's got a lot of content in it that you can go back to. But basically, these are the two broad strokes components that come into financing an affordable development. Debt is the borrowed money that has an expectation of repayment. And that's typically based on interest rate, which is determined by a number of considerations for the project's feasibility and risk. Hard debt is the type of loan that you get from a conventional bank, just like you would with a mortgage. There's an expectation that it's going to be repaid on a monthly basis in installments. And that's going to be based on the rent, as we discussed earlier, and which I'm going to talk a little bit more in a second. Soft debt is a term that's used to describe the public funds that go into it that are technically a loan to the project, but don't necessarily need to be repaid ever, or potentially, or if ideally they're repaid actually from that cash flow, or what tends to be called residual receipts. If you see that term, they're kind of similar concept. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, but similar enough. There's some technical differences. So the soft debt is money that either is going to be paid last on an ongoing basis, or it gets repaid at the end of the affordability period. So that's your debt. Equity, right, is that investment money that goes in, and that is more volatile. It's not a fixed payment that you're going to get every month. It just depends on the project, how well it performs, as they say. So that cash flow is going to pay your equity. Also, if the project is refinanced in the future at a higher value or sold, that the proceeds will pay the equity investors. And it's considered more risky because, unlike debt, which has sort of a guaranteed payment every month, there's no guarantee that the project is going to have cash flow. And LIHTC equity, which we're going to talk a little bit more about, is sort of somewhere in between. Sometimes it's called soft equity. It's not paid back in the same way that traditional equity is, as we kind of talked about. It's, the compensation comes from the tax benefits.
So, yeah. They just state this where the hard debt means that there's a payment you have to make every month. There's a set schedule or you're in default. Soft debt is sort of, you know, friends and family are sort of a loan, right? Like, I know you're good for it, you're going to pay me back, we'll figure it out, you know, take half of the cash flow, something. Yeah. And the big difference with equity is that it's ownership. If you are an equity investor, you own part of that project. And how the investor gets repaid for taking that ownership risk varies, but equity always means ownership.
Right. Thanks for that. And with soft debt, you might get more favorable interest rates, more favorable terms, so you can extend it for a longer period of time or things like that. I'm not going to go through all of this, but you can take a look later. This quick calculation is based on assuming an 81 unit property, which is sort of the sample project that we keep going to. That's getting about $13.20 per month in rent. And this basically walks through how that rent that gets you the net operating income that we described before allows you to figure out how much debt you can borrow, how much money you can borrow as debt. In this example is a 6% interest rate loan at a 30-year term. So again, thinking about like a mortgage, similar concept there. And what results is that $6.7 million loan of hard debt, right? That monthly payment that has to be made, and that becomes one of the sources in the project that you'll see later. It's only a small source, or pays for a certain share of it. So we kind of already walked through this, sort of the spectrum of funding sources that go into a project. What's important to note here is, the conventional debt only pays for a small share, as I just said. The equity is in an affordable housing project is typically going to come from the low-income housing tax credit, but there might still be a gap that remains, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. How do we fill that gap, or how do we address the gap? But first, we're going to talk briefly about LIHTC, which is a very technical program that could merit its own 3-hour presentation, but we're not going to do that. What's most important to understand is that it's a tax credit-based subsidy that is made available by the Treasury, right? So it doesn't come from HUD. It emerged in 1986 out of a tax reform legislation. This was at a time when HUD was very unpopular and people didn't think it could do its job, so they wanted to shift the responsibility of investing in affordable housing basically to the private market, so it's sort of a public-private partnership. How the tax credits are awarded to projects is determined by what's called the Qualified Allocation Plan. And the Qualified Allocation Plan, this would be key for the folks in the room. This is basically where all the criteria that goes into determining which developers get tax credits, that's all baked into the Qualified Allocation Plan, which is overseen by what's called the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. If you ever see CTCAC, that's sort of the department in the Treasury that oversees this whole thing, and they have a board, and that includes folks from the State Housing Community Development Agency, Housing Finance Agency, and they get together and develop this QAP, Qualified Allocation Plan, and that's where you're going to have your criteria. For example, ensuring that the project is sited in a high opportunity area, right? That it has access to transit and green space and high quality schools, that it's not near a polluting highway or oil refinery, something like that. You're going to demonstrate that in the application process for the LIHTC. Also, building amenities, right? Are you providing deep affordability? Are you providing on-site case management and social services, things like that?
So is this a property tax credit, or what tax are they getting credit on?
On their income. So yeah, so the vast majority of LIHTC investors are banks. So that's their incentive. They have, and this is also what makes LIHTC somewhat arguably unreliable, is when there's a period of economic downturn and it's not, banks aren't generating as much profit, the tax credit is a lot less, desirable. So you saw in the recession, the federal government really has to intervene to make the credit more desirable to get people to want to keep investing in it.
So it's not the affordable housing entity that gets tax credit, it's the investor, the owner.
Right, so I'll explain this a little bit. There's a diagram a little later on, which I'll get to, which kind of, in a basic way, explains that relationship. But yeah, basically think about it as investor puts in some money, and in exchange they get this credit against their profit, and that money is what, through an elaborate process, gets converted into, or the credit gets converted into cash for the project.
Then is the person who's getting the loan, how do they benefit? Do they get that money at a lower interest rate because they're getting the tax credit?
So again, this isn't a loan, right? This is equity. This is complementing the loan that you have on the project. The determination of what $1 of tax credit becomes in the project is based on a number of factors. The pricing, so the price of a LIHTC is negotiated as project by project, and will vary by market. In San Francisco, very, very competitive place where a lot of banks want to get, well, I don't want to get too into the weeds. But
so your question is sort of what is the return for the investor? Or how does the tax benefit, or how does the tax credit benefit the project?
How does it make the project affordable?
So a low-income housing tax credit investor never sees $1 back from a project. So they put $10 million in, get $0 back. And the reason they do it is they're saving money on their income taxes over here.
They're just giving the project.
No, because it's saving.
Because what they do is they buy in put in $10 million, and you say, okay, now I'm the 99% owner of this building. And this building yields tax benefits to me. So I don't need cash back. My accountant's going to take that off of my income taxes, and I'm going to put 10 in and save 11 over here.
As long as they don't.
As long as you own the building.
So does that cash flow, that if it any accumulates, goes to them as the owner?
Typically, generally not. There's a lot of work that goes into avoiding that, because if they're starting to get cash, that's income, and they're trying to get income tax benefits. So they're trying to give the money to the nonprofit and take the tax benefits over here.
It's just a way to make the money available for the project.
Yeah.
And the simplest example, if an investor pays $1 for a credit, and they get $1 reduction in there, that's sort of like the break even would be paying $1 for the credit and then getting $1 reduction in your income. But then there are other benefits that come into play that make it attractive, as well as incentives based on regulation and this whole community development world to get banks to invest in low income and moderate income communities. So it's not just the financial return, but there's also sort of regulatory reasons that banks and other investors invest in low income housing tax credits. But again, this is like a whole other thing that we could spend a few hours talking about.
Don't get confused by the bank's part of it. It's not a loan. It's the insurance companies or,
Insurance companies.
Other people invest in these projects.
Is the financing happening with individual investors, or is the pocket of money that the developer gets from low-income tax credits?
It's typically larger institutional investors because the cost of doing a tax credit project is so big. When the credit started, you would see 2 or 3 doctors buying a sixplex with the credit, those sorts of things, or building a sixplex. That doesn't really happen anymore. It's now, minimum $3 million.
And that goes into the project as a equity source, right? So you're not paying monthly costs on that. And so to the developer, it's essentially a subsidy. It's how it's experienced at the project development level.
Can you explain the part of ownership and what is that influence with it? What happens when, and this can be quick or say, this is not it, but many of our affordable houses that at the end of the 55 45-year
Yeah.
this restriction, are they part of that decision-making of what happens next? It's like the equity investors?
Oh, yeah.
They are.
So,
Okay.
in order to get the share of their ownership in the project determines their share of the credits. So if they're only 50% owner, they only get 50% of those credits. So that's why you see that they're 99.99%. But that means they own 99.99% of that building. And so the credits flow over 10 years, and then they stop. The compliance period for Treasury is 15 years, and then that regulatory oversight stops, which is typically through the state. And so at year 15, your year 15 projects is the term you might hear, that investor typically wants out because they're still getting some benefits, but much smaller. So they want to leave, but they own 90% of the building. And so if that building has gone up in value over those 15 years, typically you have to compensate them for that to get them to leave. So it's a significant negotiation. And it's one of the reasons why you see a lot of jurisdictions pushing out the affordability from 55 years to sometimes 99 years.
Yeah.
Because, to explain it simply, if there's a time horizon which the affordability requirement burns off,
Yeah.
and that has market value, right? You say, okay, it's not going to go to market for 30 more years, but it's in downtown Oakland, like there's money there, right?
Yeah.
But if that's 99 years,
Then
right? So,
okay.
and one of the biggest leverage points is the public sector who put those dollars in, who put the gap dollars in to say, you know, we have a stake in this too. We've got a $3 million loan here. So we have to be compensated. So,
And so there's a lot of more fun details we can get into on the low-income housing tax credit, but I think this is actually a good segue to the state and local sources because that is where those restrictions come into play. So fortunately in California, through this qualified allocation plan and through the state regulations, there is a 55-year affordability restriction. So that's over and above what the federal government requires. Other states don't have that. Other states it might be 30 years or less. But also in California, you know, when other public sources come into play, that's where you can add additional affordability restrictions. So getting back to this project example, you know, we have the mortgage at $6.7 million. That's paid for by the rent. We have the LIHTC equity, which is calculated in a very complicated way that we can talk about another time. And that's going to cover a good chunk. In this case, you know, around 60% of the project cost. There's a question? Oh, okay. What I didn't talk about, it's kind of skipped over, is that there are two programs. There's the 9% credit and the 4% credit. The 9% is the juicy one that covers a good chunk of the development cost, and that's highly competitive, meaning there are far more applications for that funding than there are credits available to fund them. And that's why you can have all these criteria in the application process to really bump up the quality of the projects that are coming forward. So in this example, we're assuming this is a 9% deal, so it covers a good chunk of the project cost, but there's still this gap, right? We need to get the $35.9 million. The uses of the funds for the land and the building costs and soft costs that we talked about earlier have to match the sources. That's key. So in order to make this project work, you're bringing in this case, in this example, home money, which I'm going to talk about in a second, and then county housing money, which might be from a bond measure or some other local source that fills the gap. In this case, what is the gap? You know, 10% or so of the project, but might be as high as 20, 30, 40% in places like San Francisco, where it's very expensive to build and the rents are still relatively low. So how do we address the remaining gap? I'm going to try to do this very quickly. One way is to shrink the gap, right? So that's essentially either increasing your net operating income, which means either including higher income renters in the project, which is complicated and difficult to do for a variety of reasons, squeezing the operating expenses, figuring out ways to operate the building more affordably and efficiently, getting better terms on your loan, things like that, reduce the construction costs. So this is why there's so much interest in things like modular housing. There's this promise of reducing construction costs, which will make everything easier to finance. That's one way. The other way is to fill the gap, right? You can't completely shrink it away. You can fill it with other funding sources. And there's a whole bevy of funding sources at the state and local level that play that role. And this is not even a comprehensive list, but you have a lot of examples here today. I'm just going to be talking about a handful. So federal block grant programs, local bonds, state funds, so funds that are available at the state level, and then a couple of local policies that generate project funding. So how many people here are familiar with CDBG, the Community Development Block Grant Program? So some folks have heard of it. This is the largest block grant program for affordable housing purposes, although as the slide sort of indicates, it's available for a lot of different uses. So only about 25% or so of CDBG money nationally goes towards affordable housing. It's also used for economic development, social services, sometimes, market rate development to pay for infrastructure. That's considered, economic development. There are a lot of ways you can use it. This is an example of the federal government devolving the responsibilities to pay for affordable housing community development projects to states and localities. So here's a check. It goes to a qualified locality or state. They have to create what's called a consolidated plan. I don't know if anyone here has participated in. Yeah, I'm sure some folks have, which where you have to outline sort of what is the housing need, how are you going to address it, what's the community outreach process going to look like, how to prove that consolidated plan, and that's what allows you to get community development block grant money, as well as home money, which is the other big federal block grant program. And so there are some requirements on the income levels that's conserved. The affordability restrictions are pretty low, but if you're bringing in other sources of funding, that's typically not an issue. It's at about $3 billion annually at the federal level, and it's been pretty much declining over time pretty consistently, especially accounting for growing population and inflation and things like that. The home program, again, a block grant program. Has anyone here worked with home or seen projects funded through home? So this is specifically for affordable housing. It's funded at a slightly or significantly less money, and it can be used for a wide range of project types. So that's, it could be down payment assistance, it could be tenant-based rental assistance, new housing construction, housing rehab, et cetera. But unlike CDBG, this has to be used for housing uses. And there are a variety of rules related to the income restrictions and things like that. But localities are ultimately granted this money, and then it's up to them to decide how to dole it out to different projects. And sometimes there's a very public process for doing so. It might go into what's called a housing trust fund, which I'll talk about briefly in a minute. It might just happen as part of the budgeting process. So City of Oakland, in their budgeting process, when they're looking at how they're going to support all these different programs, a chunk of that's going to come from these block grant programs. The next category I wanted to talk about are state programs, and there's a variety of them. Some are administered through the State Housing Community Development Department. There's also a housing finance agency. These are just two that I thought might be relevant to folks in the room here. One is ASIC, the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, which is funded out of the cap and trade money that the state collects every year to offset carbon emissions. So this is a great program. It provides sometimes up to a quarter of the funding for a project, but there are a number of conditions that you have to meet to get this money, and it's highly competitive. The primary purpose of the fund is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So affordable housing developments that access this fund have to demonstrate how they're incorporating land use, housing, transportation, and agricultural land preservation into this. So it's really trying to prioritize what's called infill development. So within cities that are already built out, near public transit, you're showing how you're providing green space. They require giving free transit passes, those types of additional things. And that's what allows developers to qualify for this program, which is basically a grant or soft debt that we talked about earlier. So money that is kind of like a grant, might have to be paid in the future. And it's very competitive again. So there's a few $100 million that this generates, the cap and trade generates every year that can go towards this. And a lot of developers apply, and many of them do not get it. Is there a question?
So realistically, is the amount of money they offer enough to drive a developer towards a project, or developers go for a project and then they're looking for money and this happens to maybe fill that, need?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's probably a little bit of both, but I think increasingly more the former. I think that because of how competitive the project is or the program is, and just how much funding this brings to the table to fill a gap, it really is, and this is the idea behind the program, is to incentivize developers to think more about the environmental impacts when they're doing their affordable housing development, and to really start to link in a holistic way affordability to health and environmental concerns. So, but yeah, I'm sure people try to apply for the funds to be opportunistic, but they're not likely to get it unless they can really demonstrate how you're lowering greenhouse gas emissions by reducing automobile travel and things like that.
This is, can I make one more comment? This is Solange from the state.
Great, thanks.
I think it's really important for people in the room to know that local health departments are eligible to be sub-applicants for this program. If they're implementing a related program as part of the application, that it strengthens the application to show that the public health department is partnering and being a sub-applicant with the main applicant. And that also local health departments are eligible to partner to support stronger community engagement. And the Los Angeles County Health Department did a really good job supporting the county in applying for several grants and receiving them by facilitating really strong community engagement.
Thanks for adding that. Yeah, that's really important. I mean, one of the main points of this program is to encourage collaboration across different departments. So housing departments, transportation departments, as well as public health. There's a little bit in this for everyone. And the more collaboration and thinking across systems that you can do in this project, the more competitive your application is, and ultimately, in theory, better the projects will end up being. And there are requirements for community engagement and other pieces along the way. No Place Like Home is another state program that was brought into being in 2016. This is a $2 billion program that is being repaid through Mental Health Services Act funding, and this is targeting permanent supportive housing. So really deeply service-enriched housing for homeless folks primarily, and people in particular with mental health conditions. So if you have access to this money, we have to demonstrate how you're gonna address those very specific needs in the development. Local bond measures is another critical source, and this is something we're seeing a lot more of increasingly, as we know the need for affordable housing has grown and the costs have grown, and the federal funding for affordable housing has decreased. In short, these have to be approved by ballot measure typically, and require a 2/3 majority, though there are efforts to lower that.
Yeah, I would say BARHII's policy committee decided to support a constitutional amendment to lower that to 55%. It's currently like they're having a really hard time getting it out of the assembly. So if anyone feels like their counties could weigh in on it, a lot of our counties have taken support positions. So if anyone feels like they could support this publicly, let me know, because they really need some pushes right now to pass that. And that would really enhance our ability to make sure we could actually raise revenue in our jurisdiction.
Thank you.
ACA 1. Yeah.
So yeah, getting to that 2/3 majority, that's a high threshold. It requires a lot of resources to develop a campaign and do outreach, get people to want to support it. But we have seen some great successes in recent years. All these A's, I don't know why A tends to be the letter that's chosen, A for affordable. There were a few measures that passed in 2015, 2016. 2015 saw San Francisco's Prop A for $310 million. Alameda County, Measure A1 for $580 million, and Santa Clara County, Measure A, generated $950 million in 2016. And this source of fund, it's a bond in that it's a lump sum of money that you can generate in the short term through attracting investment that's being repaid through a revenue stream generated by taxes. So Measure A or Prop A in San Francisco is based on property tax increase. I think it's about $8 on average of a property tax increase over 18 years. That gets you this big chunk of money up front to pay for affordable housing. And I'm being told to wrap up, so really quickly, another important source that folks in the room would be interested in and thinking about around sort of the advocacy strategy are impact fees, inclusionary housing programs, and commercial linkage fees. Have folks heard about these? Are they familiar with the concept? So just really fast, housing impact fees, it's a fee that's levied against a new development, a market rate housing development, to offset sort of increased demand for affordable housing that comes when you bring market rate development into a neighborhood. And that's typically a dollar amount per unit. Commercial linkage fees, similar. It's an impact fee that's assessed to commercial and typically and sometimes industrial warehouse developments. Typically, or sort of a dollar amount per square foot over a certain threshold, and that's to offset the economic developments and economic impacts that occur through new business development as rents increase and more affluent folks move into a neighborhood. Inclusionary housing, primarily it's a policy to try to get market rate developers to include affordable units on site, but they almost always have what's called an in lieu fee option, meaning instead of providing that unit on site, they have the option to pay separately or pay into a fund. And all these sources, as well as a variety of other sales taxes, document recording fees, real estate transfer taxes, all these different local and county taxes may go into an affordable housing trust fund. And this map shows all the trust funds that exist in the United States, over 700 of them now. It's a relatively recent concept, but basically it's an account that a local agency controls and provides funding for affordable developments and filling that gap.
Since folks are working at the county level, I'll just point out a word of caution on these. If you're working, there are places within your county where you have market rate development that's not super sky high rent, where it's really close to the cost of production. Adding these costs will make it harder to supply those units, particularly if you're sort of on the edge of an urban area or something like that. So around the country, we see a lot of places where the demand is sky high, so these really just sort of cutting into profits theoretically, and other places where you still have market rate development of workforce housing unsubsidized, and these fees hit that pretty hard. So just recognize that they can cut both ways depending on your context.
And I think if there's one thing you take from, so we're going to kind of close this presentation here, and I think if there's one thing you take from this, it is really those questions about like how are we balancing making projects that actually work for developers while also trying to include things like affordable housing and other community benefits that we know we need in order to have healthy development.
Quick question was the return on investment. Like, how do you make that? I mean, if you don't have that information, how do you get that information?
What the return is?
Yes.
You'll never get it.
Exactly.
The public sector, I mean, the public agency will get it if they're requesting anything from any financing or anything like that. I mean, they'll see the pro forma.
And jurisdictions will do
for nonprofit
For
projects.
the nonprofit, not for profit, you never get it.
For a market rate project, you're getting a contribution from the city or density bonus.
Anyway, I'm just saying, like,
Yeah.
it's hard to balance the trade-off in a
Right.
community when you lack that information.
And our jurisdictions will do things like feasibility studies when we're passing those kinds of policies that say like, okay, approximately in the different parts of our jurisdiction, like what could we expect? What can we layer on top of? I want to close this presentation here now.